how you're going to do that is by just clicking the link that you used to join the meeting today. We will make this recording available, and you should be able to share it with anyone who is, unable to join today or to watch again in the future. So during the webinar, you'll notice that most of you are muted and your videos are turned off. So to ask a question, you can either use the chat function or you can raise your hand when we get to the Q&A part of our presentation, and we can sort of unmute you individually to ask a question, for example. Let's see, we're going to answer as many questions as possible at the end of our presentation, but I do ask that you hold really specific project questions for a follow-up conversation. We do encourage you to reach out and discuss specific projects that you might have in mind, but what that does is ensures that Reclamation can have the appropriate regional and local representatives present and aware of your project, and that we have time to really appropriately consider any of your project-specific questions to give you the best information possible. All right, next slide, please. Okay. So Reclamation's authority for this small storage program comes from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that is known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the bill, as I'll probably call it throughout this presentation. And that was enacted November 15th of 2021. And what the bill does is provides $100 million from fiscal years 2022 through 2026 to establish and implement this new competitive grant program for what the law calls small water storage and groundwater storage projects. Okay, and here is where we have an important update to share with all of you joining today. And that is that the law defines small as a project that has a storage capacity between 200 acre-feet. It was previously 2,000 acre-feet and 30,000 acre-feet. So again, the minimum storage capacity is 200 acre-feet now, down from 2,000. However, the maximum storage capacity is 30,000 acre-feet, and that has stayed the same. Additionally, projects have to increase surface water or groundwater storage or convey water directly or indirectly to or from surface or groundwater storage. So that amendment that expanded the storage capacity requirements of the law was passed as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. That's Public Law 117-328. For anyone who wants to look it up. And then that passed at the end of December of 2022. So the next funding cycle that we offer will fall under those parameters. Okay, so what this also does, this amendment widens the capacity restrictions under that law and likely makes more projects eligible. It also probably makes the program more competitive, right? The more projects competing. So for those of you who may have reached out to Reclamation to discuss project eligibility in the past, and found that the answer was your project was not eligible due to the size of the storage capacity, please consider, reaching out again in light of this change to discuss, consideration of your project again, if you think that's, appropriate. All right, next slide, please. So just again, for those joining who are unfamiliar with the program as a whole, going to walk through some high-level requirements of it, is starting with eligible entities. Eligible non-federal sponsors do include states, a regional or local authority, like a water district or water association, for example, tribes, tribal organizations, all within the 17 Western states, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. So those are known as the reclamation states. If you have a question about where your project is located and whether it's eligible, please reach out. Cost sharing is required by the law, and awards can be made of up to 25% of total project costs. However, not to exceed $30 million. That's a per project limit. So whichever is less, up to 25% of your project costs or $30 million are, it can be awarded under this program. Next slide, please. All right, the law also directs reclamation to give priority to projects that are likely to provide more reliable water supply for states, tribes, and local governments that are likely to increase water management flexibility, are quote unquote regional in nature, have multiple stakeholders, and provide multiple benefits. So that language, comes directly from the law. And if that sounds like your project so far, we definitely want to hear from you. If you are, at all interested in how reclamation assessed this priority direction, we did we did release a notice of funding opportunity, the fiscal year 2023 notice of funding opportunity that has since closed, but you could see eligibility criteria listed there to kind of get a sense of how we were looking at this program in its first year. Next slide, please. All right, one final piece of language I did want to point out in the law is that the bill also requires the Secretary of the Interior to determine the project complies with feasibility study guidelines that are issued by Reclamation, is technically and financially feasible, provides a federal benefit, and that sufficient non-federal funding is available to complete the project. These determinations are really informed by a completed small storage feasibility study. So that's a key thing to know about what the feasibility study process in this program tries to accomplish. Next slide, please. All right, so guidelines for said small storage feasibility studies have been issued and published by Reclamation in the form of a Reclamation Manual temporary release that can be found on our website. We can link to it specifically here as well, and you'll see the link on your screen right now. In order to receive grants for planning, design, and construction, non-federal project sponsors have to submit completed small storage feasibility studies for review and approval by Reclamation. And then to that end, I would turn it over to my colleague Hannah to walk through the feasibility study report contents from a high level for you all.
Sure, thanks, Carrie. So if you're thinking that your project would be a good fit for the small storage program, the most important initial step to take is going to be that submission of a small storage feasibility study for review and approval. Any eligible project sponsor will first have to submit a feasibility study for review, and Reclamation must find that it meets all of the requirements of our directives and standards just mentioned by Carrie. We accept feasibility study reports at any point in the year for review. However, something to be aware of is that any future NOFOs will require that projects have an approved feasibility study in order to apply. So the requirements outlined here on this slide are scaled back compared to the level of a traditional or congressionally authorized federal feasibility study for other types of water resources projects. Please note that this DNS is specific to the small storage program, as these are feasibility studies. As are these feasibility studies. Some of you may be familiar with Reclamation's traditional requirements for feasibility studies. However, the requirements for small storage feasibility studies are spelled out uniquely and explicitly in the DNS referenced today. So you can see here a list of topics required to be addressed in the feasibility study. we request, first of all, some basic introductory information, such as a description of the project, including the study area. A statement of problems and needs identifies the specific water resources problems your feasibility study is seeking a solution for, including as it relates to demand for the supplies. The third section is the opportunities section, which asks the project sponsor to identify the various storage opportunities that exist in the study area, as well as the potential beneficial uses for those supplies, an assessment of stakeholder support from the public, local water agencies, for example, any implementation challenges, the available market for stored water, and other existing storage projects in the area. The next section is a description of alternatives. This asks you to consider the alternatives that might solve the identified problem, including non-structural alternatives. You will define planning objectives and how each alternative meets those or does not, and to what extent. You also describe in detail each alternative under consideration, including cost estimates and a corresponding cost of the project water produced, expressed in dollars per acre foot. We'll also be looking to know what the non-federal project sponsor's plan is if federal funding were not provided. Section 5 is the economic analysis. We want to see in a nutshell the economic benefits that project implementation would realize relative to costs. Benefits of the project shall also be documented and described quantitatively wherever possible. And also required is a justification for why the small water storage project is the selected alternative in terms of meeting objectives, demands, needs, and benefits. We want to know why this storage project is the best solution of all possible alternatives, including the no action alternative. Additional required sections of the feasibility study include an analysis of risk and uncertainty associated with the project details, discussion of environmental impacts sufficient to allow Reclamation to assess the potential measures and costs that will be required to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, which is required if Reclamation provides funds for construction, and any legal and institutional requirements such as water rights, contractual obligations, Indian trust responsibilities, appropriate jurisdictions, permitting requirements, etc. And finally, we will need to see as a requirement of the law that sufficient non-federal funding is or will be available to cover the non-federal share of project costs if the project moves to construction, as well as to cover all necessary operations, maintenance, and replacement costs associated with the project. Instructions for demonstrating this last requirement are available in the Reclamation Manual DNS, Title 16 Financial Capability Determination Process, which you will see referenced in our temporary release. I should also note that there is flexibility concerning format. If you already have some of the information that is required in this DNS from other reports that you've previously prepared for whatever reason, you can use that to meet these requirements, but there will have to be some kind of crosswalk document that clearly identifies what information is available to match up with the requirements of our DNS. You need to be able to see how and where each DNS requirement is addressed. So that can be done using a table, dividing the report into headings that correspond to these sections here, providing page numbers to find information, or reordering the information that you already have to correspond to these sections. Information provided needs to be specific to the project under consideration. And as for the review process, once Reclamation receives your completed feasibility study, we will do an initial review to determine all relevant information is included. We cannot initiate a formal review process without doing so. So we may have to send studies back to the sponsor for more information consistent with the DNS. And the review team will then decide whether the study meets program requirements within 180 days once that formal review begins. At that point, the project is eligible to compete for funding if it is found eligible. Next slide, please.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Okay, so next steps. We said earlier that really any future notice of funding opportunity is going to require that projects have an approved feasibility study in order to apply. So the first step in seeking funding under our program is to go ahead and submit your completed small storage feasibility studies. Or if you have a question about eligibility, right, reach out to your local reclamation office. We do anticipate the fiscal year 2024 small storage program funding opportunity will open in summer or fall of 2023. That's currently what's listed on our website, and that's the most up-to-date place to get information. So as soon as we have a closer or a more finalized date, it will show up there. Again, if we're talking about summer and fall, right, earlier the better for submissions on your feasibility study. And that is because reviews can take up to 180 days by Reclamation. So you want to ensure plenty of time for Reclamation to review and approve your feasibility study so that you are good to go when any notice of funding opportunity opens to apply. And then again, sign up for our mailing list, check our website. You will have the most updated information about the program. Grants.gov, of course, has all of the notice of funding opportunities. So to touch briefly then on the competitive process, once we issue a funding opportunity, for eligible applicants to apply to, an application review committee is formed with expertise across reclamation. What they do is review each application, applying the evaluation criteria, right, which is found in that notice of funding opportunity, and score the applications. And then we rank projects based on those scores and allocate available funding in accordance with those rankings. So in FY23, our last funding opportunity, there was $20 million to be allocated. We do anticipate awards being announced in the springtime of this year. And we anticipate a similar amount of funding will be made available for our fiscal year 2024 funding opportunity. But again, stay tuned and we will have an exact number available for you all shortly. Next slide, please. All right, so please take a moment to look at some of the resources that we've identified here. Again, they're available on our website, and we do request that you hold specific questions about your project today. However, if you reach out to your local reclamation office, again, we can discuss your project and this program in greater detail. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions about the program as amended that we've talked about today, or just general program requirements discussed today. And I think we can go to the next slide just to get to the point there. So let's see. We'll start with some of the written chats. Okay, I saw Hannah answered David's question about slides being made available to participants. There was a question about the water storage capacity requirements of the law. The law talks about a projects with a storage capacity of not less than 200 acre-feet, not greater than 30,000 acre-feet. So that is, again, total capacity. Okay. Let's see. So our ditch and reservoir company is eligible. I would say it depends, I guess, on the ditch and reservoir company. We are looking for public institutions, so not private, if that helps at all. And if there's further questions there, please reach out to us. Okay. Reiterating on small storage, and thank you for the opportunity to reiterate it. I think it's kind of the most crucial point, but again, the law defines small as storage capacity not less than 200 acre-feet, not greater than 30,000 acre-feet of storage capacity. And then there's some, discussion of what's a surface water storage, groundwater storage project. Okay, we have a question about the requirements from the secretary. Again, that's getting at that the project complies with the feasibility study requirements issued by Reclamation, that the project is technically, financially feasible, provides a federal benefit as determined by the secretary, and that sufficient non-federal funding is available to complete the project. So the question is, are there guidelines to determine capacity to complete the program within a specified time? I'm not sure that I am tracking that question. So if there's some additional context there, really there are various ways that we would assess financial feasibility, technical feasibility. I would encourage you to review Reclamation's published guidelines that we link to in the chat and that are also available on our website to get at how we are trying to meet those requirements for the Secretary's office as part of the feasibility study submission and review. There's a question, would we be able to submit a feasibility study for review prior to securing funding? Not only were you able to, you must. So you cannot apply for funding without having an approved feasibility study. So if you're interested in this program, if you think you're a fit, reach out, let's talk about it, and then submit your completed small storage feasibility study for review and approval. Have there been any changes to the format or requirements of the feasibility study since last fall's call? Not materially. There were some minor updates to our published temporary reclamation manual release. I would defer to Austin or Hannah from my office if there's anything that I'd be missing there.
No, Carrie, I think you got it. There's nothing materially different. It might impact the review process, or it might just provide more granular information as to what interest rate to use for this year for economic analysis, for example, but nothing materially different at all. And the end of the release does have a bullet point list of what those updates actually were to the TRMR. So if you go to the TRMR, scroll to the back end of the PDF, Reclamation actually lists out what we've changed in it for the public's information.
Looking for a clear definition of small storage, right? The law defines that as small projects are those with a storage capacity not less than 200 acre-feet, not greater than 30,000 acre-feet. A question about federal benefits and how we would define that. Again, this is really something that is going to be discussed as part of your feasibility study, but we are really looking for the direct benefits associated with the beneficial use of the water supply, right? The water created, the additional water made available through your storage project. Where is that water going? When will it be used, and for what purpose? Right? So some examples would be water supply for irrigation, for municipal and industrial use, for ecosystem enhancement, for example. Okay, got a question about the level of interest in the first cycle. So I said we had $20 million available. We did receive eligible submissions that total in excess of that $20 million. So we did have more demand than there is available funding for the program. We anticipate that to continue based on what we've seen. Okay, let's see. Can the technical feasibility be answered in various documents, or does the feasibility need to be a standalone document? We want, it has to comply with our requirements, which typically would be, you can rely on existing documentation that you may have, right? There is flexibility concerning format, but we're looking for a singular document to answer all of the questions that are in that temporary reclamation manual release. So we've gone through quite a few chatted questions. Maybe we'll take a couple of hands now.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. We have one hand up from John Longworth. John, I'm going to give your microphone access, and you will have to unmute. There you go. So if you could unmute, you have the ability to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we
I
can.
can hear you.
Great. I have just a scheduling question. As I understand it, as early as this summer, applications would be due. And obviously, if there needs to be 6 months review time for feasibility studies, is there really, at this point, do we just have to wait? I mean, we're in the process of doing a feasibility study, but it's still going to take a month or two. Are we basically then waiting for the next cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it, to give you an answer, it depends, of course, on, the scale, complexity of your project, the associated documentation, how thorough you believe you've met the requirements when you're submitting them. We can take the review requirements in our temporary release, say that reclamation essentially has up to 180 days for that review. I would say that historically, and again, I've got 1 year to base this off of, our reviews have taken place faster than that, but I can't commit to anything faster than that. I think if you were to aim, for submitting your feasibility study here within the next month, that likely puts you in a advantageous position that to give reclamation sufficient time to review. I don't think it's like if you don't have one today, you're out of it. That makes sense. But
Great.
I do think, yeah, yeah.
And I'll work with my area office to just kind of go over the project.
Yeah, absolutely. If you reach out to them, they can set up a meeting, and we're happy to be, as part of that call. We just want to make sure everyone's aware and, available to answer the appropriate questions there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we have Chip Fisher. Chip, I'm going to unmute your mic or give you access to your mic. You will now have to unmute it. Chip, do you have access to unmute your mic? You should have that now. Okay, Chip, we'll see if we can come back to you on that, okay? We want to go through a few more in the chat, and then we'll come back and see if we can get Chip's mic working.
Perfect. All right, so we had a question about, do we expect the $20 million, sorry, the lights have gone off on me here. The $20 million total pot of funds may be increased given the recently passed infrastructure bill. Oh, okay, so I think the question is asking essentially, we were provided $100 million for this program as a total. We have 20 million for the last NOFO, which leaves us with a balance of 80 million left for the program to allocate. I did say we anticipate the next notice of funding opportunity would have a similar amount to the first year. So in the $20 million range, again, final number, to be determined. Right now, though, I do not know of any opportunities to increase the amount of funding available for the program beyond the 100 million total. Certainly think that there's demand out there, but it's all reliant on Congress, and I haven't heard anything at this point about extending the program or providing more funding for it. So maybe that would become more clear as we get closer to fiscal year 2026, which is when the program expires and the funding is no longer available. Time frame to execute projects, right? Does execution mean completion of construction? So our reclamation's authority to carry out the program expires at the end of fiscal year 2026. So, September 2026. Yeah. Yes. And so, what that means is we would want to have awarded the available funding by then. There's still likely some, it's not to say that your project has to be totally completed and constructed by that point in time. That being said, we are interested in essentially shovel-ready, projects that are seeking funding. Okay, a question about how groundwater storage should be estimated, perhaps some lessons learned from the first round. So it's a great question. We know that, how to assess the storage capacity of a groundwater project is tougher than it is a tougher question to answer than it is for a surface water project. We do know the law allows for groundwater projects, and therefore what we're kind of looking for, what I would say to that question is, we're looking for a project that, must increase yield on average above existing conditions to identified beneficiaries in the environment. So with your groundwater project implemented, how much more water on average is available? An average annual yield of 200 acre-feet for the project would certainly meet the requirement, right? Not to get us too confused between yield and capacity there. So this means if you're looking at, say, an aquifer storage and recovery project, for the purposes of the small storage program, what we are most interested in is the recovery component, right? How much water can be recovered, for what purposes, and when. And you would note, just put the caveat out there that may look different and possibly even more complicated for a managed aquifer recharge project. That's my best answer there for you. Okay, let's see. Should I do one more question, or were we able to get Chip back?
I think Chip has a question in the chat.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, can the funds be used for compensatory mitigation costs, or are they restricted to the construction costs of the project? If that was your question, Chip, I can take my guess at that. The law says planning, design, and construction, right? So if as part of construction, we also National Environmental Policy Act compliance is required. So if part of that determines there's some mitigation that needs to be completed as part of the project, I think that all is rolled into construction costs. If the question is, can we apply for funds to cover a mitigation effort in essence, I don't think that's a project that we'd be interested in under this program. We'd be really looking at benefits, right? So how are we benefiting, the environment? How are we benefiting, folks who need water versus mitigating for, some other action? Again, would defer to Hannah or Austin there to add any context to that response. Okay, we'll keep cruising down these questions. Will there be funding for the program in future years? We do anticipate that there will be a future years, at least a future years funding opportunity. Right, we know that fiscal year 2024, there will be a funding opportunity, and we do anticipate at least one more after that. But we don't know exactly, what that looks like or how much funding would be available. Again, Austin or Hannah, anything to add there?
No, I think you got it, Carrie.
All right. Okay, how do you sign up for our email list? So the small storage website, you might have to scroll up because there's a lot of questions in the chat, but we do link to that here in this presentation. And it's just, sorry, let me even like pull it up and read you the link quickly. It is just usbr.gov /small storage /. So you should be able to find that in the chat, and on that website you will see a sign up for our email list.
Carrie, I'll put a direct link to that in the chat for folks.
Sure, thanks. Oh, I think we have a follow-up question. I'm not tracking what the first question was. So let's see. Sorry, folks, just trying to. Eric, you had a question. I mean, non-federal funds. I'm blanking on what that was related to up above that I said. So if you could just retype your question. Oh, would we be able to submit a feasibility study for review prior to securing non-federal funds? That's the question. Yes. However, we will be asking, what the plan is for the non-federal funding. So as part of what we'll ask too is, what would you do in absence of any, funding? If you had to fund the project entirely on your own, what's the plan for that, right? And we want to see that there is a plan for that, knowing, of course, that the goal is to seek additional sources of funding for the project. I hope that helps. Okay, if a feasibility study, a small storage feasibility study was submitted and found not feasible, or that it did not meet our requirements, and the project would like to resubmit, do you recommend a whole new feasibility study, or can we only submit changes? We would recommend the full scale resubmission of your feasibility study. At that point, we do have to, reconvene a new review team. And treat it with fresh eyes. So, reach out to Reclamation and let's talk about your project first before you do that, right? To make sure that really makes sense. And that, hopefully we can give you some really good guidance on what resubmission might look like. And if it, but it would be essentially, resubmitting your feasibility study as a whole. And maybe you could identify some areas, for the review team to hone in on that have strengthened or improved since last time. Okay, sorry, Eric, I got your question wrong again. The question was, may feasibility studies be submitted in advance of securing required matching funds? So again, yes, but we need the plan for securing those required matching funds. Again, I'll defer to Hannah, Austin, anything there.
Yeah, that's actually also true for applying under the NOFO. There needs to be letters of support, obviously, showing for the project. There needs to be a plan in place to meet that cost share, etc. The funds don't necessarily need to be on hand for that. That would be part of any subsequent agreement with Reclamation. If the funds were to be awarded, of course, that match would have to be proven, right? So again, it doesn't have to be on hand per se, but there does need to be a formalized plan, and that starts with demonstrating that in the feasibility study.
All right, we got a question. Let's see. Can the storage component requirement include subsurface storage of managed aquifer recharge derived from surface water that exceeds the 200 acre-foot threshold? What I would say is it sounds like let's talk about your project in a follow-up conversation, because there might be some really specific context that we would want to discuss. I don't know if Austin or Hannah, you have any sort of comments on that.
I just say we're happy to discuss any conjunctive use strategies and then how that yields at least 200 acre feet. Again, that would meet minimum eligibility. It's just a matter of packaging that into one project that can then be shown as a feasibility study and meet the requirements, right? How does that surface water interact with subsurface aquifer storage or managed aquifer recharge to then yield that net gain? What is the plan? How does that work? Is whatever that plan is permittable into the future, et cetera, all those aspects you'd want to look at in the feasibility study.
All right, and then there's a question of construction of the project begins prior to receiving small storage funding. Does that disqualify the project from potential funding? So it's a great question, right? These are non-federal projects in nature. However, for the federal government to participate in your project, we have to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. And so what that does say is that essentially no ground disturbing activities can take place before reclamation is authorized, to essentially, in this case, authorized to fund a portion of the project. So it really comes down to how you're characterizing the activities and the correlation to the environmental compliance that is required. So again, gonna be specific, but I would say in general, yes, it would essentially disqualify a project from funding if there's ground disturbing activity taking place. But again, let's talk about your project, more specifically and what that, additional questions or context might be. We talked about Chip's question. I see we have a hand up. Let me answer Kathleen's question, and then we'll take the hand. There was a question about, is there a cost share? Yes. Yes, there is, absolutely. The federal government can award up to 25%, which means the non-federal cost share is a minimum of 75%. And that is a statutory requirement. It comes from the law, so there's not any wiggle room there. Okay, let's see. Do we have a hand up?
Yeah, I can unmute Sherry. I believe Sherry has two outstanding questions in the chat.
Oh, got it.
Sherry, you should be able to unmute your mic now.
Thank you. So besides the two questions in the chat, I had a follow-up question regarding the estimation of the groundwater recharge for the small storage. So the 200 acre feet on average. So across what period of time? How would we, is it up to us to define what that period of time is, or do you guys have a standard of time, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, or what are we talking about to average?
Yeah, if it was so for example, taking the most extreme example, if it was a 200 acre feet provided over 500 years, we'd say that's not eligible. I think for 200 acre feet, we're, more looking at, so getting out of the yield discussion, we've gotten into that a little bit because it's a little easier to think about that for aquifer storage and recovery projects, and especially managed aquifer recharge projects. But for the law is more about capacity. What is that usable capacity? And we've tried to, especially for groundwater projects, be a little, I don't think flexible is necessarily the right word, but trying to just let projects characterize what works for them. Some projects have a more dedicated flow per se, where the inflow is, it's maybe not as variable. Whereas some projects, they have a rather large capacity, but the yield's much lower. Reason being, all the water is acquired during wet years, injected, and then recharged on an average annual basis, which might be above 200 acre feet, et cetera, but maybe the capacity that was injectable was 15,000 acre feet. In that example, well, I'd say the capacity is more like 15,000. It's just a low yield groundwater storage project, right? So I use the quotes because it's a little harder to walk that versus a surface storage where we can see that's easily engineered to say, the capacity of the project's X, our usable capacity above dead pool is Y, for example. So not sure if that helps you, but especially for that lower tier, I definitely think we're talking 200 acre feet at least on an average annual basis in terms of yield. That absolutely would meet the test. But again, the test by the law is a capacity. So you could have an average annual yield below 200 acre feet. It's just going to be really hard to, it might get harder to show that. And it also comes a question of, for a project of that size, are we really talking maybe about the best fit under the reclamation, umbrella, so to speak? There are other programs out there that would fund, a really small storage activity of a project that likely is not more than $5, $6, $7 million. I wouldn't think at that size. So a lot of context there, but I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Yeah, we may need to try to schedule a call with our engineers that are much more versed in all of these values and durations of time and stuff. So we're just trying to get a general idea, but thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and then to follow on another question from Sherry, right? Expansion of a wastewater treatment plant, right? There's sort of a specific example here. And I think what stuck out to me in this question is the reference to recycled water. So again, Austin just talked about the umbrella of programs that Reclamation offers, funding opportunities. We do have our Title 16 water recycling and reuse program. And so as soon as we hear recycled water, we want to have a conversation between our programs about which one makes sense. So again, would suggest following up, like it sounds like we're going to do anyway, right, to talk a little bit more about the specific context. Okay. Let's see, 7 minutes left. I'll try and get through the questions. If we complete a feasibility study, but it's too late or it doesn't, work out for this program, would it help with other programs? It's a good question, right? Each individual program at Reclamation is going to have its own unique requirements. So there's feasibility study requirements for small storage. There are also feasibility study requirements for Title 16, and they're not identical, to that end. So I think having that information consolidated, coherently laid out in a completed feasibility study ultimately is to the benefit of the project, but I wouldn't say it directly correlates to, getting you further ahead in relation to any other funding opportunity at Reclamation. Are there lessons learned for irrigation storage projects that applied and didn't meet the federal financial benefit or economic analysis requirements? So yes, it's a great question, right? We do ask both for that financial piece, right? The sufficient non-federal funding to complete the project, right? We are looking, to supplement projects, but we're also, there's a risk there for the federal government to fund a project that really does not have capability, absent additional funding, that they don't have a plan in place essentially without grant funding from the federal government. So that would be the number one is, really establish your plan for how you might, tackle taking on that project absent any federal funding. And even if it's a stretch, even if it, it would be challenging. And then on the benefits side, it's an important question because we are looking to see your economic analysis and in particular, the benefits of your project relative to costs, right? So, essentially a benefit cost analysis or a ratio there, right? That could show your project is economically justified, as we would say, that the benefits outweigh the costs. If that's not the case, then we'd be looking to see, we'd also want to look at the cost-effective nature of your project, right? And your alternatives analysis and all of the alternatives that were looked at is the one that you're recommending, maybe the most cost-effective in terms of justifying the project. I would, I guess, defer to Austin on any other points there.
No, I think
Okay.
you covered it.
Okay. All right. So question, if awarded by 2026, can the project be completed by, say, 2040? Or by shovel ready, did you mean a specific time of construction? So my question on my follow-up question to that would be, are we talking about a 14-year construction period? And if so, you know, what is the magnitude of that project, right? I think we're looking for projects that have a level of detail that can be captured in a feasibility study, right? That gives us a pretty good timeline of, you know, when it can be implemented. And so I'm not sure if having something that far out would be, you know, necessarily competitive. I'm not going to say maybe it's totally ineligible, but we have to, you know, essentially obligate that funding by that time frame. It doesn't necessarily mean your project needs to be completed by then. I think there would be some questions, though, if project completion is not going to take place until 2040, 2050, right? Years and years and years out. That would probably come up in the review of your feasibility study. Okay. Can multiple existing documents be submitted with a single crosswalk to comply with the feasibility study requirement, or is one single existing document plus the crosswalk only? Great question. So what I would say is the easier you can make it on Reclamation to review and approve your feasibility study, the better. So if we are cross-referencing, you know, 20 different documents that are hundreds and hundreds of pages each, right? It becomes very challenging to tell the full story of your project. And we have found that projects that have submitted, you know, oh, we did this study for this grant and this application for this, and we think your answers to here are here and that answer is here, you know, it's not that we can't get the information that we need. It's just that it's a lot harder. And sometimes there's confusion between the multiple supporting documentation. And so I think it's to the applicant's benefit to really have a streamlined document that answers each of those questions. And, you know, if the response is go see page, you know, 17 of this appendix, then at least give some more context to what page 17 is going to show us, so we know what to look for and how to interpret it. Okay. Question about planning and design, right? But that we're focused on shovel-ready projects. The planning, design, and construction are eligible to be funded by the law. Because the law also requires a completed feasibility study be approved before we can fund the project, we are assuming that a lot of the planning has, you know, taken place. It's not to say some planning and design costs can't be covered as part of your award. It's just a recognition of the level of planning that it takes to get to a completed feasibility study. Is what I'm is sort of what I mean by, you know, we're not having a planning only notice of funding opportunity, for example. Okay. All right. We're at our last minute. So planning and design costs incurred after November 15th, 2021, but before grant award eligible for reimbursement, that is going to be subject to the exact notice of funding opportunity that you apply for. So the NOFO that you apply for will discuss what, you know, pre-award costs are eligible. And it's, you know, entirely essentially subject to reclamation approval, but there will be more information in the NOFO. Okay. I can try to answer these final 3 questions if folks have time to stay on, but if not, thank you all so much for joining us today, and please reach out with your questions, reach out to your local area office, and we're happy to discuss your project specifically or the program as a whole, any questions you have. Thank you all again, and I'll go ahead and try and get through these last 3. Oh gosh, okay. Reservoir silt removal eligible. We're not interested in operations, maintenance, and replacement activities, for example. So that sort of seems like it might fall under that category. And again, happy to talk more specifically about that project. And then again, additional comment on projects that might be in the planning phase by their 2026 award. Again, you know, it just depends on the project, but we have to just obligate, you know, our authority for the program expires in 2026. So what it means for your project specifically, you know, let's talk about. And then, do you recommend a phased approach to funding requests? We apply for part of the funding in 2024 and you know, or do we apply for the full build out of the project? So the feasibility study is going to characterize your full project, right? Whatever that is. And then the notice of funding opportunity is where you can determine whether you want to apply for in part or in whole. What I would say on that part is I think there's strategy probably either way, depending on how expensive your project is. But you know, the same project can come back and compete for funding year after year until you've reached your maximum cost share. You know, assuming you're an eligible project, you've got the approved feasibility study. You know, you can apply for those sequential years of funding, but not for the same work you've already received funding for. And then there's also, if your project is selected to receive an award, but only for a portion of the funding requested, right? So again, the project sponsor, you know, can include that unfunded request in subsequent years. And you know, that's all to say, it depends. All right. Thank you all. Again, additional questions, please reach out. Happy to talk further and anytime about the program. And thank you all for your time. I appreciate you joining us today. Everybody take care.